A man worth millions sits alone in an upscale restaurant, disguised in ordinary clothes. He's not here for the expensive wine or gourmet food. He's searching for something money can never buy: genuine human connection. After months of isolation following a devastating personal loss, he's given up hope that anyone could see past his wealth to the broken man underneath. But when a young waitress approaches his table, something in her tired eyes tells a different story. As she serves his wine, her trembling hand slips him a folded napkin. He expects a phone number or a request for money. Instead, when he opens it, 5 simple words stop his heart and bring tears to his eyes. Words that will change both their lives forever. Marcus Sterling had learned that wealth was the cruelest magician of all. It made genuine human connection disappear. At 45, he commanded a tech empire worth $300 million, but the penthouse overlooking downtown Seattle felt more like a mausoleum than a home. The marble floors echoed with emptiness, and the floor-to-ceiling windows offered a view of a world he could no longer touch authentically. 3 months ago, his wife Sarah had lost her battle with cancer, taking with her the only person who had ever seen him as just Marcus. Not the CEO, not the fortune, just the man who still got nervous ordering pizza over the phone. The funeral had been a parade of calculated sympathy. Board members, investors, and acquaintances had offered their condolences with the same practiced tone they used in quarterly meetings. Their words felt hollow, their embraces mechanical, and their concern transparently temporary. He realized with crushing clarity that Sarah had been his only bridge to humanity, the one person who could call him out on his flaws without agenda. Without her, he was surrounded by mirrors, reflecting only what people wanted him to see. The loneliness wasn't just emotional, it was existential. A deep questioning of whether anyone would mourn Marcus the man if Marcus the mogul disappeared tomorrow. In his desperation for authentic connection, he had started what he called his reality checks, disguising himself as an ordinary person and venturing into the world Sarah had always encouraged him to see. He would shed his designer suits for thrift store clothes, trade his Tesla for an Uber, and sit in coffee shops or restaurants where nobody knew his name or net worth. These excursions were his attempts to feel human again, to experience interactions untainted by the knowledge of his wealth. But even in disguise, the encounters felt hollow. Service workers going through motions, conversations that never moved beyond pleasantries, connections that dissolved the moment he left. Tonight's venture to Luminous, an upscale bistro downtown, was supposed to be different. Sarah had always wanted to try their wine selection, and he thought perhaps experiencing something she had dreamed of might help him feel closer to her memory. Dressed in a simple sweater and worn jeans, with his usual confident posture deliberately slouched, he looked like any middle-aged man dining alone, unremarkable, invisible, and desperately hoping someone might see him anyway. He had no idea that the evening would challenge everything he believed about human nature, and that a stranger's simple act of recognition would crack open the walls he had built around his grieving heart. Marcus chose his disguise with the careful precision of an actor preparing for his most important role. In the guest bedroom that had become his dressing room for these excursions, he laid out clothes that told a different story. A navy sweater with a small hole near the left elbow, jeans that had been washed so many times the denim had softened to the texture of silk, and leather shoes that showed honest wear rather than designer distressing. He removed his Patek Philippe watch, replacing it with a simple Timex that had belonged to his father. The transformation wasn't just physical. He practiced changing his posture, letting his shoulders drop, allowing uncertainty to creep into his usually commanding presence. Looking in the mirror, he saw not Marcus Sterling the tech mogul, but simply Marcus, a man who might worry about his mortgage payment. The Uber ride to Luminous gave him time to settle into his persona. He slouched against the worn seat, avoiding the driver's attempts at conversation, not out of arrogance, but from a genuine shyness that surprised him. Through the rain-streaked window, he watched the city he had helped shape with his investments and innovations, now seeing it from the perspective of someone who lived within it rather than above it. The restaurant appeared through the gloom like a warm beacon, its golden light spilling onto the wet sidewalk. Other couples and groups hurried past under umbrellas, their laughter and chatter a reminder of the social connections he had lost. He paid the driver in cash, adding a generous tip that felt natural rather than calculated. The heavy glass doors of Luminous opened to reveal everything Sarah would have loved. Exposed brick walls, lined with wine bottles, soft jazz floating over the murmur of intimate conversations, and the rich aroma of herbs and roasted garlic. The hostess, a striking woman in her 30s with perfectly styled blonde hair, assessed him with the trained eye of someone who sized up customers for their spending potential. Her smile, bright and professional when she'd greeted the couple ahead of him, dimmed noticeably as she took in his modest appearance. "Good evening," she said, her tone polite but noticeably cooler. "Do you have a reservation?" The question carried an undertone that suggested she hoped he didn't, that perhaps he had wandered into the wrong establishment. "No reservation," Marcus replied, letting his voice carry less authority than usual. "Just hoping for a table for one." The hostess glanced at her tablet, then at the bustling dining room, where every table seemed occupied by couples in designer clothes or groups of business associates. "We're quite busy tonight," she said, her fingers hovering over the screen without actually checking availability. "Let me see what I can do." After a theatrical pause designed to emphasize the inconvenience, she looked up with a forced smile. "I can offer you a small table near the kitchen. It's not ideal, but it's what we have available." She gestured toward a cramped corner where the swinging doors created a constant percussion of service noise. It was the restaurant equivalent of Siberia, where undesirable customers were quietly exiled. Marcus nodded graciously, following her through the maze of linen-covered tables, feeling the subtle stares of other diners who wondered what someone like him was doing in a place like this. The corner table was everything the hostess had promised, cramped, wobbly, and positioned where the kitchen's chaos provided a constant soundtrack of clattering dishes and shouted orders. Marcus settled into the uncomfortable chair, noticing how the other diners' conversations seemed to flow around him like water around a stone. From his vantage point, he could observe the restaurant's social ecosystem in action, the way servers lingered longer at tables occupied by well-dressed couples, how the sommelier appeared magically when expensive bottles were being considered, and how his own table had been forgotten in the 10 minutes since he'd been seated. The irony wasn't lost on him that in a place Sarah would have loved, he was experiencing the very invisibility she had always tried to help him escape. He picked up the leather-bound wine menu, its weight substantial in his hands, and began reading descriptions of vintages that cost more than most people's monthly salary. It was then that she appeared, not with the practiced urgency of the other servers, but with a quiet presence that seemed to calm the chaos around her. She was perhaps 28, with auburn hair pulled back in a simple ponytail and eyes the color of warm coffee. Unlike the other staff who wore their professionalism like armor, there was something genuinely gentle about her approach. Her uniform was impeccable, but showed the subtle signs of someone who had been on her feet for hours, a slight crease in her apron, shoes that were comfortable rather than stylish. What struck Marcus most was the way she moved with deliberate care, as if she understood that every gesture mattered, every interaction was an opportunity to make someone feel seen. When she reached his table, she didn't glance dismissively at his modest clothes or seem annoyed by his remote location. "Good evening," she said, her voice carrying a warmth that felt genuine rather than performative. "I'm Elena, and I'll be taking care of you tonight. I'm so sorry you've been waiting. We're a bit overwhelmed this evening. There was no excuse-making in her tone, no suggestion that his table was less important than the others. She placed a water glass before him with the same attention she might give to the mayor's table, and Marcus noticed her hands. They were steady, graceful, but bore the small scars and calluses that spoke of someone who worked with purpose beyond this restaurant. "Can I start you with something to drink while you look over our menu?" She waited patiently, not tapping her foot or glancing toward more lucrative tables, simply present in the moment with him. For the first time in months, Marcus felt like he was being seen as a person rather than a problem to be managed. There was something in Elena's eyes, not pity for his solitary dining or judgment about his appearance, but a kind of recognition that he couldn't quite place. It was as if she understood loneliness not as a concept, but as a lived experience, and in that understanding she offered him something he hadn't expected to find tonight: dignity. When she smiled, it reached her eyes in a way that reminded him of Sarah's ability to make anyone feel like the most important person in the room. "Take your time," she said softly, placing the wine list closer to his reach. "I'll check back in a few minutes." As she moved away to attend to another table, Marcus realized he was holding his breath. There was something different about this young woman, something that made him believe that perhaps authentic human connection hadn't died with Sarah after all. When Elena returned with her notepad, Marcus had made a decision that surprised even himself. "I'd like to try the 2015 Barolo from your reserve collection," he said quietly, watching her face for any flicker of surprise or doubt. The wine cost $400 a bottle, easily twice what his modest appearance suggested he could afford. Elena's pen paused for just a fraction of a second, not in judgment, but in what seemed like gentle concern. "That's an excellent choice," she said evenly, her voice carrying no hint of the skepticism he had expected. "It's one of our most celebrated bottles. Would you prefer it by the glass, or would you like the full bottle experience?" Her question was posed with the same respect she might offer any patron, as if his ability to appreciate fine wine had nothing to do with his faded sweater or worn shoes. "By the glass, please," Marcus replied, and Elena nodded with genuine enthusiasm. "Perfect. It's a wine that deserves to be savored slowly. I'll bring it right out." And as she walked away, Marcus caught sight of the hostess near the bar, her eyes tracking Elena's path with obvious concern. He watched as she intercepted Elena near the wine station, their conversation brief but clearly heated. The hostess gestured toward his table with barely concealed disdain, while Elena's posture remained calm but firm. From his corner, Marcus couldn't hear their words, but he could read the body language, the hostess questioning Elena's judgment, Elena defending her decision to treat him with dignity. The interaction lasted less than a minute, but it revealed everything about the two women's character. When Elena returned, her professional smile was intact, but Marcus caught a slight tightness around her eyes that spoke of the small battle she had just fought on his behalf. The Barolo arrived in a proper burgundy glass, presented with the ceremony it deserved. Elena poured a small taste, waiting respectfully as Marcus swirled the deep ruby liquid and inhaled its complex bouquet. The wine was magnificent, earthy, with notes of cherry and tobacco that spoke of the Italian hillsides where the grapes had grown. "It's perfect," he said, and Elena's smile became genuinely radiant. "I'm so glad you're enjoying it. That vineyard has been family-owned for 6 generations." As she poured the full glass, Marcus realized she wasn't just serving wine. She was sharing something she clearly loved. Her knowledge wasn't the rehearsed spiel of a trained server, but the passionate understanding of someone who genuinely cared about the stories behind what she served. In that moment, the expensive wine became secondary to the human connection being offered alongside it. Over the next hour, Marcus observed Elena as she moved through her section with quiet grace. She remembered details. The businessman at table 12 preferred his water without ice. The elderly couple at table 15 needed their check split, and she somehow managed to appear at each table exactly when needed, without ever seeming rushed. More importantly, he watched how she treated everyone with the same genuine attention she had shown him. The wealthy couple, celebrating their anniversary, received her warm congratulations, but so did the young man, dining alone, who was clearly stretching his budget for a special occasion. She didn't laugh louder at rich patrons' jokes, or linger longer where larger tips awaited. Her kindness was democratic, offered freely to anyone who crossed her path. Marcus found himself hoping his wine would last longer, not because of its excellence, but because it meant Elena would continue to check on him, continuing to make him feel like he mattered in a world that had forgotten how to see him. As the evening progressed, Marcus found himself lingering over his wine longer than he had originally intended. The Barolo had opened beautifully, its complex flavors evolving with each sip, but it wasn't the wine keeping him anchored to the uncomfortable corner table. It was the anticipation of Elena's gentle presence. When she approached for what he assumed would be her final check, she surprised him by pausing longer than usual. "I hope you don't mind my asking," she said, her voice softer than her professional tone, "but you seem like someone who appreciates the stories behind things. This Barolo, it's from a vineyard that almost went under during the 2008 recession. The family sold everything they owned to keep it running because they believed their land had something special to offer the world." She gestured toward his glass with genuine reverence. "Sometimes I think about how many small acts of faith it took to get that wine into your glass tonight." Marcus looked up at her, struck by the unexpected intimacy of the observation. Here was someone who saw poetry in service, who understood that every bottle carried the dreams and sacrifices of real people. "You know wine," he said, not as a question, but as recognition of a kindred spirit. Elena's cheeks flushed slightly. "I'm studying to become a sommelier," she admitted. "It's taking longer than I hoped. Life has a way of demanding detours. But I believe that wine is one of the few things that connects us directly to the earth, to history, to each other." There was a wistfulness in her voice that spoke of dreams deferred but not abandoned. "When I serve a glass like this, I'm not just pouring wine. I'm sharing a story that began in Italian soil and will end with your experience of it. That feels sacred to me." The conversation that followed was unlike any Marcus had experienced since Sarah's death. Elena didn't ask about his job or try to impress him with her knowledge. Instead, she spoke about the restaurant industry's hidden poetry, how she could read people's stories in their dining choices, how food and wine were humanity's oldest languages. She told him about the elderly man who came in every Tuesday to order his late wife's favorite meal, sitting at the same table they had shared for 30 years. She described the young couple who saved for months to afford one special dinner, and how she always made sure their evening felt magical regardless of what they could afford. Her observations weren't gossip, but gentle anthropology, a deep appreciation for the human drama that unfolded nightly around white tablecloths and flickering candles. When she finally excused herself to attend to other tables, Marcus realized something profound had shifted inside him. For the first time since Sarah's funeral, he had been part of a genuine conversation, not as Marcus Sterling, the CEO, but as a person whose thoughts and feelings mattered to another human being. Elena hadn't seen his modest clothes and dismissed him, nor had she tried to guess his wealth and adjust her behavior accordingly. She had simply recognized him as someone capable of appreciating beauty and story, someone worth sharing her dreams with. As he watched her move through her section with renewed energy, he understood that their brief connection had been as meaningful to her as it was to him. In a world that often felt transactional, she had offered him the gift of authentic human recognition, and he found himself wanting desperately to offer something equally valuable in return. As the evening wound toward its natural conclusion, Marcus found himself reluctant to leave the cocoon of warmth that Elena's presence had created around his forgotten corner table. The restaurant had begun to empty, couples and groups settling their checks and disappearing into the Seattle night, but he lingered over the last drops of his Barolo, savoring not just the wine, but the memory of genuine human connection. When Elena approached with his check, there was something different in her demeanor, a slight nervousness that hadn't been there before, as if she was wrestling with a decision. She placed the leather folder on the table with her usual care, but her hand trembled almost imperceptibly as she did so. "I hope everything was to your satisfaction this evening," she said, her voice carrying the same warmth, but with an underlying current of something he couldn't quite identify. Anticipation, perhaps, or uncertainty. "Everything was perfect," Marcus replied honestly, reaching for his wallet. As he placed cash in the folder, the exact amount, plus a generous but not ostentatious tip, Eleanor hesitated beside his table. She seemed to be gathering courage for something, her fingers fidgeting with the small notepad in her apron pocket. Finally, with a movement so subtle he almost missed it, she withdrew a small piece of paper folded into a neat square. "I hope you don't think this is inappropriate," she said quietly, her cheeks flushing with embarrassment. "But I wanted to give you something before you left." She placed the folded note beside the check folder with the same reverence she had shown the wine, as if it contained something precious and fragile. Marcus stared at the small white square, his mind immediately jumping to the most obvious conclusions. A phone number, perhaps, though Elena seemed too professional for such a gesture. Maybe a request for help, given that he had clearly demonstrated he could afford an expensive bottle of wine. He felt a familiar disappointment beginning to settle in his chest, the same feeling he had experienced countless times when people's true motivations revealed themselves. Had he been wrong about Elena? Had their connection been as transactional as every other interaction in his carefully constructed world? His hand hovered over the note, suddenly afraid to open it, and discover that the evening's magic had been an illusion. That even here in this forgotten corner of an upscale restaurant, authentic human connection was just another commodity being offered for the right price. But something in Elena's expression stopped his cynicism from fully taking hold. There was no calculation in her eyes, no expectant smile suggesting she was waiting for a reward. Instead, she looked almost vulnerable, like someone who had taken a tremendous risk and was now terrified of the consequences. "I should let you enjoy your evening," she said softly, stepping back from the table. "Thank you for being such a wonderful guest." As she turned to leave, Marcus realized that whatever was in that note, it had cost Eleanor something to write it. The tremor in her hand, the flush in her cheeks, the careful way she had placed it on the table, these were not the actions of someone running a con. They were the gestures of someone offering something genuine and hoping it would be received with the same spirit in which it was given. With a mixture of curiosity and trepidation, Marcus reached for the folded paper, knowing that whatever he found inside would either restore his faith in human nature or shatter it completely. Marcus unfolded the small piece of paper with the careful precision of someone defusing a bomb, his heart hammering against his ribs as he prepared for disappointment. The handwriting was neat, feminine, written in blue ink on what appeared to be a page torn from Elena's order pad. But as his eyes scanned the words, his breath caught in his throat. It wasn't a phone number or a request for money. Instead, in careful script, Elena had written, "I don't know your story, but I recognize the look of someone carrying a heavy loss. Tonight, watching you appreciate that wine and listening to you speak about stories and connections, I saw someone who understands that the most beautiful things in life are meant to be shared. Your wife must have been an extraordinary woman to have loved someone with such a gentle heart. I hope you find your way back to joy." The words blurred as unexpected tears filled his eyes. Below the main message, Elena had added a postscript that made his chest tighten with emotion. "P.S. The way you listened when I talked about my dreams reminded me of my grandmother, who always said that the rarest gift you can give someone is your complete attention. Thank you for seeing me tonight, not just as your server, but as a person with hopes and stories worth hearing. It's been months since anyone has done that. Marcus read the note twice, then a third time, each reading revealing new layers of compassion and insight. Elena hadn't just seen through his disguise. She had seen through to his grief, his loneliness, his desperate need to feel human again. More remarkably, she had done so without pity or judgment, offering instead a recognition of shared humanity that cut straight through his carefully constructed walls. The reference to his wife hit him like a physical blow, not because it was unwelcome, but because it was so precisely accurate. Somehow in their brief conversations, Elena had intuited the shape of his loss without him ever mentioning Sarah directly. Perhaps it was the way he had lingered over the wine Sarah would have loved, or how his face had softened when Eleanor spoke about connections and stories, the very things Sarah had always valued most. The note revealed that Elena possessed an almost supernatural ability to read people's emotional landscapes, to understand that his solitude wasn't chosen but imposed by grief. She had looked at a man dining alone and seen not just loneliness, but the specific quality of loneliness that comes from losing someone who had been your anchor to the world. What moved him most was Elena's final paragraph. Your capacity to find beauty in small moments, the way you savored that wine, how you smiled when I shared the vineyard story, tells me that love didn't end with your loss. It just needs new places to grow. I believe your wife would want you to know that grief is love with nowhere to go. And maybe tonight is the first step toward finding new destinations for all that love you still carry. Marcus pressed the note against his chest, feeling something crack open inside him that had been frozen solid for months. Here was a stranger who had not only seen his pain, but had offered him a roadmap back to living, written with such tenderness that it felt like Sarah herself might have guided Eleanor's hand. For the first time since the funeral, Marcus Sterling wept. Not tears of despair, but tears of recognition that authentic human compassion still existed in the world, and that perhaps he was worthy of receiving it. The tears came without warning, decades of carefully controlled emotions breaking free like water through a cracked dam. Marcus sat in his forgotten corner, clutching Elena's note as his shoulders shook with the force of grief that had been held in check for too long. The restaurant's ambient noise, the clinking of glasses, the murmur of remaining conversations, the distant sound of kitchen cleanup, faded into white noise as he experienced something he hadn't allowed himself since Sarah's funeral. Complete emotional surrender. Each word of Elena's message had been a key, unlocking chambers of his heart that he had sealed shut to survive the crushing weight of loss. But now, in this unexpected sanctuary created by a stranger's compassion, he finally felt safe enough to remember not just Sarah's absence, but the profound love that absence represented. What broke him completely was Elena's insight about grief being love with nowhere to go. For months, he had carried Sarah's love like a burden, a weight that made every interaction feel hollow because no one could receive what he had always given to her. He had tried to bury that love along with his wife, convinced that feeling it would only amplify his pain. But Elena's words reframed everything. The love didn't need to die with Sarah. It needed to find new expressions, new recipients, new ways to honor what they had shared. The young woman who had served his wine had somehow understood that his capacity for deep feeling wasn't a wound to be healed, but a gift to be shared. In recognizing his grief, she had also recognized his heart's continued ability to connect, to appreciate beauty, to find meaning in the stories that bind us together. The note trembled in his hands as he reread Elena's observation about his gentle heart and his wife's extraordinary nature. Sarah would have loved Elena instantly, would have seen in her the same rare combination of wisdom and kindness that made people feel truly seen. Marcus could almost hear Sarah's voice, encouraging him to pay attention to this moment, to recognize it as a sign that life still held possibilities for connection and joy. She had always believed that love multiplied when shared, that opening your heart to one person made you more capable of loving others. Elena's note was proof that Sarah's faith in human nature had been justified, that even in a world that often felt transactional and cold, there were still people who led with compassion and saw beyond surface appearances to the struggling souls beneath. As his tears began to subside, Marcus felt something shift fundamentally inside him, not the erasure of grief, but its transformation from a force of isolation into a bridge toward others who carried their own hidden sorrows. Elena's note had shown him that his pain, rather than making him untouchable, had made him more capable of recognizing and responding to others' struggles. For the first time since Sarah's death, he felt not just the possibility of healing, but the responsibility to use his own experience of loss to help others navigate their own dark passages. The wealthy, powerful Marcus Sterling had been humbled by a waitress's wisdom, but the man underneath, the one who still carried infinite love for his late wife, had been reminded that he was still capable of both giving and receiving the authentic human connection he had thought was lost forever. Marcus remained at his table long after the restaurant had nearly emptied, the note still clutched in his hands as he wrestled with a decision that felt monumental. Elena had disappeared into the kitchen, giving him space to process her words, but he could see her occasionally through the service window, helping with closing duties while stealing glances in his direction with barely concealed concern. Finally, as the last of the dinner guests settled their checks and departed into the night, Marcus made a choice that would have seemed impossible just hours earlier. He approached the hostess station, where the blonde woman who had dismissed him earlier was counting receipts with obvious irritation at the late hour. "Excuse me," he said quietly. "Could you ask Elena to speak with me for a moment? It's important." The hostess looked up with barely disguised annoyance, clearly wanting to refuse, but something in his voice made her reconsider. When Elena emerged from the kitchen, her expression was a mixture of hope and apprehension, as if she feared her note had overstepped some invisible boundary. Marcus stood as she approached, a gesture of respect that seemed to surprise her. "Elena," he began, his voice still rough with emotion, "I need to tell you something, and I hope you won't think less of me for not being entirely honest earlier." He paused, searching for words that could bridge the gap between his disguise and his reality without diminishing the authenticity of their connection. "My name isn't just Marcus. I'm Marcus Sterling, and I came here tonight not because I couldn't afford to eat anywhere else, but because I was trying to remember what it felt like to be seen as a person rather than a balance sheet." Elena's eyes widened slightly, but she didn't step back or change her demeanor. If anything, her expression grew more understanding. "I lost my wife 3 months ago," Marcus continued, pulling out his phone to show Elena a photo of Sarah, a radiant woman with kind eyes and a smile that lit up her entire face. "She always believed in the goodness of people, always saw potential where others saw problems. Tonight, you reminded me of her in the most beautiful way. Your note." He held up the folded paper. "It was the first time since her funeral that someone saw my grief and offered hope instead of pity." Eleanor's hand moved to her chest, her eyes filling with tears as she began to understand the magnitude of what had transpired between them. "The wine, the conversation, the way you treated me with dignity when everyone else saw only my clothes. It wasn't charity, it was recognition. You saw me, Elena, in a way I had forgotten was possible. I have resources, Marcus said, his voice gaining strength, and Sarah always believed that privilege was only meaningful when used to lift others up. But what I want to offer you isn't charity, it's partnership. Your dream of becoming a sommelier, your understanding of hospitality as a sacred art, your ability to see people's stories. These are gifts that deserve to be nurtured. He paused, watching her face carefully. I'm opening a new restaurant concept, something that celebrates food and wine as instruments of human connection. I need someone who understands that service isn't about transaction, but transformation. I need someone who can see potential in a man in a thrift store sweater and offer him exactly what his soul needed to hear. Eleanor stood motionless, tears streaming down her face as Marcus extended his hand. I'm offering you a chance to help create something beautiful, something Sarah would have loved, not because you served me wine, but because you served me hope when I had forgotten it existed. Eleanor stared at Marcus's extended hand for a long moment, her mind racing to process the extraordinary turn her evening had taken. The man she had seen as a lonely diner nursing expensive wine was offering her not just a job, but a chance to build something meaningful from the ground up. Yet what moved her most wasn't the opportunity itself, but the way he framed it, not as charity from a wealthy benefactor to a struggling server, but as a collaboration between two people who understood that genuine hospitality was about nourishing souls as much as bodies. I don't know what to say, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. When I wrote that note, I was just trying to offer comfort to someone who looked like they needed it. I never imagined. She trailed off, overwhelmed by the magnitude of the moment. Marcus smiled gently, the first truly radiant expression she had seen from him all evening. Say yes, he said simply. Say yes to believing that your gifts matter, that your dreams deserve support, that the kindness you showed a stranger can ripple outward in ways you never imagined. Their handshake was firm, sealing not just a business partnership, but a mutual commitment to honoring the memory of love lost and the possibility of connection found. As they exchanged contact information and began discussing next steps, the restaurant around them completed its nightly transformation from bustling social hub to quiet, empty space. But the corner table where they stood felt charged with potential, as if the conversation taking place there was already beginning to reshape both their futures. Elena would later tell people that accepting Marcus's offer was the easiest decision she had ever made, not because it solved her financial struggles, but because it felt like destiny finally aligning with hope. For Marcus, watching Elena's face light up with possibility was the first time since Sarah's death that he felt truly useful, truly connected to a purpose larger than his own grief. 6 months later, their restaurant Stories opened to critical acclaim, featuring not just exceptional wine and cuisine, but a revolutionary approach to hospitality that trained staff to see each guest as a human being with a story worth honoring. Elena, now head sommelier and Marcus's partner in the venture, had developed a wine program that paired vintages with narratives, creating experiences that nourished hearts as well as palates. The corner table from Luminous had been recreated in their new space, but instead of being a place of exile, it was the most sought-after reservation, the Table of Stories, where guests could request conversations with Elena about the deeper meanings behind their wine selections. The restaurant became known not just for its excellence, but for its soul, a place where lonely diners were welcomed, where celebrations were elevated, and where every meal was an opportunity for human connection. Marcus never stopped missing Sarah, but Elena's friendship and their shared work had taught him that love doesn't diminish when shared. It multiplies. On quiet evenings, he would sit at the Table of Stories with a glass of Barolo, reading letters from guests whose lives had been touched by their simple philosophy of seeing each person who walked through their doors as someone worthy of dignity and attention. The note Elena had written that night was framed in his office, a daily reminder that the smallest acts of courage can change everything. Their story became proof that authentic human connection isn't just possible in our disconnected world, it's essential, and sometimes all it takes is one person willing to see past surfaces to the struggling soul beneath, and another person brave enough to believe that their pain can become a bridge to healing others. In the end, what had begun as a search for connection had become a celebration of it, touching countless lives and proving that genuine love never truly dies. It just finds new ways to bloom.